Section 7 of the Cambridge History of English Literature, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sonia. The Cambridge History of English Literature, Volume 1. From the Beginnings to the Cycles of Romance. Old English Christian Poetry, Part 1. By M. Bentick Smith. Only two names emerge from the anonymity which shrouds the bulk of Old English Christian poetry, namely those of Cædmon and Cynewulf, and in the past practically all the religious poetry we possess has been attributed to one or other of these two poets. But, as we shall see, the majority of the poems to be considered here should rather be regarded as the work of singers whose names have perished, as folk-song, as manifestations of the spirit of the people, in the same sense in which the tale of Beowulf's adventures embodied the aspirations of all valiant saints, or the epic of Voltaire summarized the popular ideals of love and honor. The subject of the Christian epic is, indeed, for the most part, apparently foreign, and even at times oriental. The heroes of the Old and New Testaments, the saints as they live in the legends of the Church, furnish the theme. The method of treatment hardly differs, however, from that followed in non-Christian poetry. The metrical form, with rare exceptions, is the alliterative line, constructed on the same principles as in Beowulf. Weird has become the spirit of Providence. Christ and his apostles have become English kings or chiefs followed, as in feudal duty bound, by hosts of clansmen. The homage paid to the divine Son is the allegiance due to the scion of an Anglian king, comparable to that paid by Beowulf to his liege lord Hygelac, or to that displayed by Birchnoth on the banks of the Panther. The ideals of early English Christianity do not differ essentially from those of English paganism, and yet there is a difference. The Christianity of England in the 7th and 8th centuries, and the Latin influences brought in its wake, which inspired the poetry under discussion, was a fusion, a commingling of two different strains. Accustomed as we are to date the introduction of Christianity into England from the mission of St. Augustine, we are apt to forget that, prior to the landing of the Roman missionary on the shores of Kent, Celtic missionaries from the islands of the West had impressed upon the northern kingdoms, the earliest home of literary culture in these islands, a form of Christianity differing in many respects from the more theological type preached and practiced by St. Augustine and his followers. Oswald, the martyr king of Northumbria, had been followed from Iona, where in his youth he had found sanctuary, by Aidan, the apostle of the north, to whose missionary enterprise was due the conversion of the rude North Anglian tribes. The monastery at Straonsherg, or Whitby, forever famous as the home of Cædmon, was ruled by the abbess Hild in accordance with Celtic, not Roman usage, and though, at the Synod of Whitby in 664, the unity of the Church in England was assured by the submission of the Northern Church to Roman rule, yet the influence of Celtic Christianity may be traced in some of the features that most characteristically distinguish Christian from non-Christian poetry. It would, for instance, be hard to deny that the depth of personal feeling expressed in a poem like The Dream of the Root, the joy in color attested by the vivid painting of blossom and leaf in The Phoenix, and the melancholy sense of kinship between the sorrow of the human heart and the moaning of the grey cold waves that make the seafarer a human whale, are elements contributed to English poetry by the Celts. St. Columba had built his monastery on the surf-beaten shores of the Atlantic, where man's dependence on nature was an ever-present reality. The Celtic monastery was the home of a brotherhood of priests, and the abbot was the father of a family as well as its ecclesiastical superior. The Christian virtues of humility and meekness, in which the emissaries of the British Church found Augustine so deficient, were valued in Iona above orthodoxy and correctness of religious observance, and the simplicity of ecclesiastical organization, characteristic of Celtic Christianity, differing from the comparatively elaborate nature of Roman organization and ritual, produced a simple form of Christianity, readily understood by the unlettered people of the North. It is the personal relation of the soul to God the Father, the humanity of Christ, the brotherhood of man, the fellowship of saints, that the Celtic missionaries seem to have preached to their converts, and these doctrines inspired the choicest passages of Old English religious poetry, passages worthy of comparison with some of the best work of a later, more self-conscious and introspective age. This subjectivity is a new feature in English literature, for most non-Christian English poetry is sternly epic. Beowulf is a tale of brave deeds nobly done, with but few reflections concerning them. At rare intervals, scattered here and there throughout the poem, we meet with some touch of sentiment, a foreboding of evil to come, a few words of the inexorable character of fate, an exhortation to do great deeds so that in Valhalla the chosen warrior may fare the better, occasionally a half-Christian reference to an all-ruling Father, probably the addition of a later and Christian hand, but as a rule no introspection checks the even flow of narrative. Arma virumque cano. When Christianity became the source of poetic inspiration, we find the purely epic character of a poem modified by the introduction of a lyric element. The hero no longer aspires to win gold from an earthly king. His prize is a heavenly crown, to be won, it may even be, in spiritual conflict. The glories of life on earth are transitory. Earthly valor cannot atone for the stains of sin upon the soul. The beauty of nature, in her fairest aspects, cannot compare with the radiance of a better land. The terror that lurks waiting for the evildoer upon earth fades away at the contemplation of that day of wrath and mourning, when the Judge of all the earth shall deal to every man according to his deeds. The early Christian poet does not sing of earthly love. We have no erotic poetry in pre-conquest England, but the sentiment that gives life to the poetry of Dante and Milton is not absent from the best of our early poets' attempts at religious self-expression. Beyond the fact that his name seems to imply that he was of Celtic descent, we have no knowledge of the historical Caedmon other than that to be derived from the often quoted passage in Bede. In the monastery of this abbess, id est, the abbess Hild at Straonsherj, there was a certain brother, specially distinguished and honored by divine grace, for he was wont to make songs such as tended to religion and piety. Whatsoever he had learned from scholars concerning the Scriptures, he forthwith decked out in poetic language with the greatest sweetness and fervour. Many others also in England imitated him in the composition of religious songs. He had not, indeed, been taught of men, or through men, to practise the art of song, but he had received divine aid, and his power of song was the gift of God. Wherefore he could never compose any idle or false song, but only those which pertained to religion, and which his pious tongue might fitly sing. The man had lived in the world till the time that he was of advanced age, and had never learned any poetry. And as he was often at a feast when it was arranged to promote mirth, that they should all in turn sing to the harp, whenever he saw the harp come near him, he arose out of shame from the feast, and went home to his house. Having done so on one occasion, he left the house of entertainment, and went out to the stables, the charge of the horses having been committed to him for that night. When in due time he stretched his limbs on the bed there, and fell asleep, there stood by him in a dream a man who saluted him, and greeted him, calling on him by name. "Caedmon, sing me something." Then he answered and said, "I cannot sing anything, and therefore I came out from this entertainment and retired here, as I know not how to sing." Again he who spoke to him said, "Yet you could sing." Then said Caedmon, "What shall I sing?" He said, "Sing to me the beginning of all things." On receiving this answer, Caedmon at once began to sing, in praise of God the Creator, verses and words which he had never heard, the order of which is as follows: Quorum iste est census. Now let us praise the guardian of the heavenly kingdom, the power of the Creator, and the counsel of his mind, the works of the Father of glory, how he, the eternal Lord, originated every marvel. He, the holy Creator, first created the heaven as a roof for the children of the earth. Then the eternal Lord, guardian of the human race, the almighty ruler, afterwards fashioned the world as a soil for man. Then he arose from his sleep, and he had firmly in his memory all that he sang while asleep. And to these words he soon added many others, in the same style of song, worthy of God. Book 4, Chapter 24. Translation Miller. Bede goes on to narrate how, the matter having been made known to the abbess, she caused the best scholars to test the new poet's powers, and how, when it was proved that a divine gift had, indeed, been bestowed upon the neatherd, she urged him to abandon his worldly calling and become a monk. Which thing he did, and, progressing in his new vocation, all that he could learn by listening he pondered in his heart, and, ruminating like some clean beast, he turned it into the sweetest of songs. His song and his music were so delightful to hear that even his teachers wrote down the words from his lips and learned them. He sang first of the earth's creation and the beginning of man, and all the story of Genesis, which is the first book of Moses, and afterwards about the departure of the people of Israel from the land of Egypt and their entry into the land of promise, and about many other narratives in the books of the canon of Scripture, and about Christ's incarnation and his passion and his ascension into heaven, and about the coming of the Holy Ghost and the teaching of the apostles, and again about the day of judgment to come, and about the terror of hell torment, and about the kingdom of heaven. He composed many a song, and he also composed many others about the divine blessings and judgments. While making due allowance for a possible desire on Bede's part to extol the fame of an earlier contemporary, Bede himself died in 735, we should remember that Bede is one of the most careful and trustworthy of historians, and that he lived not far from the scene of Caedmon's life. It would, therefore, appear that we have not sufficient reason for rejecting as untrue the enumeration of Caedmon's literary achievements as given in the above passage. The hymn was first published in its Northumbrian form by Wanley in his Catalogus Historico Criticus, 1705, page 287, as Canticum illud Saxonicum Caedmonis a Berda memoratum, and from that day to this it has been regarded by the majority of scholars as the genuine work of Caedmon. Bede gives a Latin version of the lines, which corresponds very closely to the original, but which he introduces thus: Caedmon coepit cantare, versus quorum iste est census, and in conclusion he reiterates hic est census non autem ordo ipse verborum, as if he had given a merely approximate rendering of his original. Much discussion has hinged upon the exact meaning to be attached to the words census and ordo, though Bede is evidently alluding merely to the difficulty of reproducing poetry in prose, for he continues, Neque enim possunt carmina quam vis optime composita, ex alia in aliam linguam ad verbum sine detrimento sui decoris ac dignitatis transferi. The West Saxon version of the lines is preserved in the English translation of Bede's Ecclesiastical History, with the introductory comment, Zara ende Bildnis this is. Now ende Bildnis simply means ordo, and it may be safe to assume that both Bede's Latin version and the West Saxon version are attempts at translation from the original Northumbrian. Bede's detailed enumeration of Caedmon's other achievements must be held responsible for the attribution to Caedmon of a large number of religious poems of a similar character, extant only in West Saxon form, in the Bodleian manuscript Junius 11, an opinion which, in the light of modern critical scholarship, is no longer tenable. Indeed, no one would today seriously maintain even that these poems are all by one author. It is more likely, as we shall see, that more than one writer has had a hand in each. But the fact that it is impossible to claim these particular poems for Caedmon does not militate against the probability of his having composed similar, though perhaps shorter pieces, which may have been worked upon later by more scholarly hands. Religious poetry, sung to the harp as it passed from hand to hand, must have flourished in the monastery of the Abbess Hild, and the kernel of Bede's story concerning the birth of our earliest poet must be that the brethren and sisters on that bleak northern shore spoke to each other in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. The most important of the religious poems at one time attributed to Caedmon are Genesis, Exodus, Daniel. From the point of view of the historian of literature, Genesis is the most interesting of these. It is a poetical paraphrase of the first of the canonical books in the Old Testament, extending to the story of the sacrifice of Isaac by Abraham. The poem opens with the praise of the Creator in a style recalling the lines quoted by Bede. The poet then proceeds to relate the revolt and fall of the angels, which, according to ancient theology, necessitated the creation of man to fill the vacant place in heaven, and then the creation of the earth, in accordance with the opening chapters of the Vulgate. At this point we have a repetition of the first motif, the fall of the angels. Satan, in anger at having fallen from his high estate, avenges himself on God by tempting man, and the rest of the narrative proceeds in accordance with the biblical narrative. Attention has been drawn to metrical and linguistic peculiarities distinguishing the second version, Genesis B, of the fall of the angels and the temptation, lines 235 to 851, from the rest of the poem, but it remained for Sievers to point out that this obviously interpolated passage was borrowed from a foreign source, that the structure of the alliterative lines resembled that in vogue amongst continental Saxons, and that the vocabulary and syntax were now and again Old Saxon, not English. Relying upon the accuracy of his observation in detail, he then hazarded the bold conjecture that these lines were an anglicized version of a portion of an Old Saxon paraphrase of the Old Testament, long lost, composed by the author of the Old Saxon paraphrase of the New Testament, commonly known as the Heliant. This brilliant conjecture has since been confirmed by the discovery in the Vatican Library of portions of the Old Saxon original, which dates from the latter portion of the 9th century. One of the Old Saxon fragments so found corresponded to a passage in the Old English Genesis. Caedmonian authorship is, therefore, rendered impossible for the interpolation, and the scholarship of the author seems to preclude the possibility that an unlearned man was the author of the rest of the poem, though Caedmon's hymns may have been familiar to, and used by, the writer. It matters little whether we assume the interpolated passage to be the work of an old Saxon monk resident in England, but unable to dissociate himself entirely from native habits of speech, or whether we look upon it as a somewhat imperfect translation from Old Saxon by some Old English monk, whom professional duties, we need only think of Boniface, had brought into contact with the learning and literature of the continent. At any rate, it is an early and a pleasing instance of the fruitful exchange of literary ideas between two great nations. The relative age of the two poems is a matter still under discussion. Genesis B cannot have been composed earlier than the second half of the 9th century, since we know that the author of the Heliant, upon whose work it is based, wrote in response to a command from King Louis the Pious, but we have hardly any data for determining whether it is earlier or later in date of composition than Genesis A. Its author, like the author of the Heliant, apparently made use of the works of Bishop Avitus of Vienne, the medieval Latin poet. Genesis A contains not a few passages illustrative of that blending of heathen and Christian elements which is characteristic of Old English religious poetry. The description of Old Testament fights shows that the spirit of the author of the Battle of Finnsburg is to be found beneath the veneer of Christianity, and on the other hand, the description of the dove, seeking rest and finding none, could only be the work of a Christian poet. The tenderness of feeling for the dumb creation and the joy in rest after toil which it expresses are due to Christian influences upon the imaginative powers of an Old English shop. Genesis B contains some fine poetic passages. The character of Satan is admirably conceived, and the familiar theme of a lost paradise is set forth in dignified and dramatic language not unworthy of the height of its great argument. In the dark regions and swart mists of hell, Satan and his host, swept thither by the Lord of Heaven himself, indulge in a joy that is purely heathen, in contemplating the vengeance to be taken on the race that has supplanted them in the favor of God. Exodus is a paraphrase of a portion only of the book from which it takes its name, i.e., the passage of the Israelites through the Red Sea and the destruction of the Egyptians. Part of the poem, in which the ancestors of the Israelites are enumerated and described, is possibly the work of a second poet, as it is simpler in style than the body of the poem, and the theme is not entirely relevant. There is certainly a break after line 445. The distinctive feature of the poem is the beauty and vigor with which martial scenes are depicted. Here again the feeling of the old epic writers under another guise is clearly apparent. Not even in Judith or the Battle of Maldon do we find more successful attempts in dramatic grouping. The din and clash of battle, though no actual battle is described, the war wolf and the raven greedy for prey, the heaving of the shields, the brandishing of battle bills, recall the martial tone of the best war poetry of our battle-loving ancestors. The author of Genesis A writes as though afraid to depart even from the wording of his original. The author of Exodus, possessed by the lust for word-painting, draws upon an exuberant imagination steeped in reminiscences of brave blows and doughty deeds, not even nominally Christian. The poem entitled Daniel need not detain us. After a historical introduction, for which the poet is not indebted to his source, he versifies selected portions of the book of Daniel. The poem has one new feature. The author uses his material for homiletic purposes, and inculcates certain moral virtues, for instance, the duty of humility and obedience to the will of God. Daniel is transmitted in the Junian Codex. A portion of the subject, dealing with the episode of the 3 children in the fiery furnace, is transmitted also in the Exeter book in a short poem of 75 lines called Azarias, in which are the beautiful lines descriptive of the change wrought by the appearance of the angel of the Lord. Then 'twas in the oven when the angel came, windy, cool, and winsome, to the weather likest when is sent to earth in the summer tide, dropping down of dew rain at the dawn of day. 3 minor poems, originally thought to be one, and by Grain called Christ and Satan, should be mentioned here, since, by reason of their being transmitted in the Codex manuscript Bodleian 11, they, together with the 3 more important poems just discussed, have been attributed to Caedmon. The first of them deals with the subject of the fall of the angels. The second with Christ's harrowing of hell and his resurrection, together with a brief account of his ascension and coming to judgment. The third with Christ's temptation. Only the first is complete. All 3 probably belong to the end of the 9th century, and all have a homiletic tendency. The second has been compared with the Christ of Cynewulf, with which it is linked by virtue of theme as well as by style. The description of the Last Judgment suggests the more impressive picture of that event contained in Christ, and the harrowing of hell recalls, and can sustain comparison with, examples of later more elaborate treatment of the same subject. By their religious fervor, and by their apparently ruder form, it is possible that these poems are nearer to the original body of Caedmon's work than the poems previously discussed. The finest of all the poems erroneously attributed to Caedmon is the fragment entitled Judith. As there seems to be ground for supposing that this beautiful fragment, worthy of the skill of a Shop, whose Christianity had not sufficed to quell his martial instincts, his pride in battle, and his manly prowess, is of later date than has been thought by certain historians, it is dealt with in a later chapter of the present volume. End of section 7.